Buon pomeriggio, davvero un benvenuto a tutti voi, just few words in Italian. Un benvenuto davvero a tutti voi per questo progetto che ha un titolo evocativo e bellissimo, Landscape Paesaggi, che nasce da questa collaborazione triennale fra le Gallerie d'Italia Intesa San Paolo e il Museo Egizio. I protagonisti di oggi ve li presento e sono Rehab Eldalil, che è una fotografa egiziana, welcome, e Johannes Auenmüller, right? Oh, ok. Che è invece il curatore del Museo Egizio, è un egittologo ed è un torinese doc da qualche anno ormai. Il loro sarà un dialogo aperto, la mia sarà una moderazione molto molto minimal, perché loro hanno davvero il piacere e il gusto di dialogare in maniera aperta e libera fra di loro, partendo da alcune suggestioni. Dialogherà dunque il mondo della fotografia con il mondo dell'archeologia e della storia, ed entrambi si occupano di uno stesso luogo, di uno stesso landscape, di uno stesso paesaggio, ma da due punti di vista completamente diversi. Quello di Rehab guarda al presente, il suo è stato un reportage bellissimo di cui ci parlerà, e invece Johannes guarda l'Egitto del passato, insomma, della civiltà egizia. Quindi sono due punti di vista completamente diversi su un unico landscape e ci racconteranno come questo paesaggio ha cambiato le persone e le comunità, come le comunità hanno cambiato il paesaggio, come la storia ha attraversato questi luoghi, e come alcuni luoghi, come per esempio il deserto, che è un'idea che mi incuriosisce molto, come alcuni luoghi, come il deserto, sono apparentemente rimasti uguali a quello che erano centinaia di anni fa, ma in realtà forse sono cambiati anche molto loro, insomma. Allora, Rehab, quindi dicevamo, è stata premiata molte volte per il suo lavoro di indagine sulla comunità indigena beduina del Sinai. Il suo è un lavoro che sta un po' in crocevia fra il documentario, il fotogiornalismo e il visual storytelling, quindi è uno sguardo molto prezioso su queste comunità. E Johannes è uno studioso, ha insegnato a Berlino, Lipsia, Bonn, Monaco, Torino e Pavia, e anche a Münster. Ok, e ha partecipato a numerosi scavi, è uno studioso e quindi aiuta, insomma, è parte di questo team prezioso che tiene il nostro museo egizio agli onori del mondo, insomma, no? Tra una delle istituzioni più importanti, non solo della città, ma dell'Italia intera, insomma. Allora, io mi piacerebbe, insomma, inquadrare questo incontro di oggi nell'ambito della collaborazione fra Intesa, dicevamo, e il Museo Egizio. Il Museo Egizio sta andando incontro a una delle sue nuove trasformazioni radicali, insomma. È fisicamente chiuso fino a metà luglio, più o meno 12 luglio, 13 luglio, però in realtà vuole mantenere un contatto con la comunità e con la città, e questi incontri sono parte di questa idea di continuare a far parlare il Museo Egizio e di continuare a incontrare i visitatori e le persone e chiudere solo per poco, insomma, nel cuore di chi ama di questa istituzione. Il Museo Egizio si aprirà ulteriormente alla città, e questo è davvero un concetto, non è una metafora, è una cosa che avverrà fisicamente con i lavori di ristrutturazione, quindi insomma sarà poi visibile questa nuova veste del museo veramente in chiave di apertura straordinaria nei confronti della città. Ripeto, non è una metafora, ma sarà un museo aperto, insomma, attraversabile. Non vi dico di più, ma avrete letto, insomma, i nostri reportage dei colleghi che si occupano di cultura, che hanno raccontato questa importantissima trasformazione. Allora, devo darvi anche qualche comunicazione di servizio, perché gli altri incontri di questo bellissimo progetto, che ha come titolo, dicevamo, Landscape, e questo è il secondo degli incontri. Il terzo ci sarà, aspettate che ve lo dico, Andrea, avrò bisogno del tuo aiuto. 3 luglio e poi l'altro? Il 10, 3 e 10 luglio, non ve li perdete, che saranno bellissimi, esattamente come questo. So I just talk about my moderation will be really minimal. I would like to propose a possible title, okay? And then let them, Rehab and Johannes, talk freely, okay? Let's begin. The first title, which is your story. How does your story as photographer for you and as an Egyptologist for you, Johannes, begin?
My story, my personal biography, how I became an Egyptologist. Yeah. I've told this story quite a number of times already, so I feel very prepared to tell this story. I grew up in Dresden, and I went to a humanist gymnasium, and I had a teacher in Latin and ancient Greek, and while studying ancient Greek and Latin, we also talked about the Greco-Roman world and ancient civilizations. And in this context also, obviously, I got then interested in all these books about the archaeology of ancient Greece and the archaeology of ancient Rome. And then there were also books about the 7 wonders of the world. And the first chapter was always on the pyramids. And this hooked me in a way. And since then, I also asked my parents and other people from my family for birthday presents. Yeah, I want some books about ancient Egypt. And so I had a constant influx of books about ancient Egypt. I continued reading. And then there was a moment for me to decide, what do I want to do in my life? What do I want to, let's say, study after I finished with the A-levels? And then it was more or less clearly defined, you know, I want to study Egyptology. And then the studies continued, and then a PhD followed, and then some other stations in some other institutions in Germany followed. And then in January 2020, I found myself here in Turin. That's my story in some brief words.
So, books about Spider-Man for other babies and Ancient Egypt for you. Books for on Spider-Man for other babies, and for you instead
I
Ancient
wouldn't
Egypt.
say that I was a baby. I think I was already 12 years and a bit older. So let's say Spider-Man was not really my cup of tea anymore. So I started, let's say, very seriously already, and in this way then also the path continued.
Okay. Rehab, for you, your story.
Sure. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give a very brief, very articulate way of how I started photography, but I've always been very interested in the arts in general. And I think my first camera, the analog, a very compact analog camera, the one that you like go like that to take a photograph, I think I was around 7 or 8 years old when I got my hands over it. I think I just stole it from my dad one day, and I fell in love with taking photographs, and then the fascination of seeing the photographs after they get developed. But I think when I decided that I wanted to be a photographer, that was around high school, and that was right after I came back from the US. So I lived in the US for a while with my parents, and then we left and decided to go back to Egypt after 9/11. And during that time, I was in this state of, like, who am I? Like, after living in the US for a while, coming back with quite of a broken Arabic accent and not understanding who I am. So I've been looking for ways to express myself using the arts. And photography was one of them. But ironically, after I started to practice photography, I found myself in love with the idea of nature photography and wildlife and taking photographs of, landscapes and of animals. But then the January 25th, 2011 Egyptian revolution happened, and it ignited this passion of telling stories of people, of my community. And from there, I would understand who am I and my own identity. And a little bit before the revolution started, I went back to St. Catherine's in south of Sinai. That's where my ancestors are from. However, I didn't know about that. I was just thought about the importance of Sinai, as my father was a war veteran and retrieving the land back from the occupation. But I started to sort of recreate or remake connections with the community instead of being an extension of my father, being myself. And that, of course, ignited after the revolution. And from there, I created very genuine connections with the community, which led me to Sheikh Jamil, who actually confided to me that my family come from the same community. And this is where my practice developed into telling stories of identity and belonging and working on this specific project for more than 10 years afterwards and so on.
Okay. We are in an immersive room. Do you want to speak about these images, these photos? Tell us something about them.
Sure. So this work is from my long-term project, The Longing of the Stranger Whose Path Has Been Broken. It's quite of a long title. It's translated Bedouin poetry. And as I explained previously, it started as from my connection with the Bedouin community in Sinai. And when I started to work on this project, the main purpose for me was to learn about the Bedouin identity, which I believe was taken from me by not knowing about my ancestry earlier in my childhood. And so I wanted, by depicting the Bedouin identity from the people who became very close to me, became almost family to me, I would understand my lost identity, my lost Bedouin identity. So as I worked on the project, I found out that no matter what I do, I became at that point partially based in Sinai, and I felt, I was completely involved within the community. I met my husband there. We started a community center with a clinic there, completely integrated. But I still felt that no matter what I do, I wouldn't be able to retrieve the fact that I was not brought up as a Bedouin. I'm still a stranger somehow. This sense of belonging is missing something. And that ignited the question about my right to narrate. And can I narrate a story about the Bedouin identity without involving the community themselves? And that, of course, developed my practice to be a lot more multimedia, a lot more, giving more space for the community to have their own voices within the project, whether within the context or within the actual visual medium itself. The project won a number of awards, and it was published as a book form in 2022. And that was the request of the community, because for them it became this alternative archive, which they had power over. They had this agency over. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much. The second title is Landscape, and I would like to know, what is the role of landscape and landscape changes for people and for things, in particular for archaeological fields?
That's a very multifaceted question, which leads to a rather multifaceted answer as well. On the one hand, there are, let's say, different approaches on how to understand landscape. There is one rather geographical or topographical approach. So landscape is indeed a space built up of particular kind of topographic or geological and other kind of features, which, let's say, offers particular possibilities to people to interact in this landscape, to use the resources that are given, let's say, by the geomorphological background or basis to the people. On the other hand, landscape also has another dimension, because landscape might not be something that is there a priori, but it's something that is always made in the moment people and things interact with each other. So the moment when people do something in a landscape or interact with geological features, then only in this moment of interaction, the landscape really exists. It's not there as an outer human extra experiential thing, but it's always perceived, made, understood. People think about, let's look at a mountain over there, and they need to think, oh, I see a mountain. It's the human perception and the understanding and giving names and identities also to those features, which only make a landscape. And in this way, a landscape, let's say, is a social space in a way that offers particular opportunities for those people who live in these spaces and who interact in these spaces. And on the other hand, and this is maybe the most important thing, we should not underestimate also the human ingenuity to transform and use and approach and encroach and modify and transform the landscape. So landscape is also not something that is only there and people make use of and then they develop, let's say, as a civilization in a place, but it's also always the other way, how people find ways to make the most of what the space around them offers to them, and how to turn these things also into something meaningful, into spaces that are then socialized and culturally appropriated by those people interacting in these spaces.
Yeah, may I say something, because this
Absolutely,
definitely
yes, that's why we are here now.
Because this definitely resonates with this specific project, because when I spoke with the community about like what it means to belong, the answer was always the land. There's always been this interconnectedness between the people and the land. Like how you identify who you are is also by being connected to your land. And I feel, and of course with a lot of diaspora generations like myself, not being connected to your land reduces your sense of belonging and your sense of identity as well. So I feel like I completely resonate with what you say, with what you're saying, like how our sense of identity transforms the landscape or the environment into an actual landscape that we're coexisting with, and how the land itself gives back the sense of belonging to us and the sense of identity as well. But the issue here comes with how humans transform this landscape, which I would like to also hear from you, like your thoughts about that.
How humans transform this landscape in many, many different ways. Since we are also here talking about the landscape of Egypt or the Sinai, I would also in this regard look back into pharaonic history. Because particularly, let's say, the setting of the fertile Nile Valley provided on the one hand the perfect natural environment for creating agricultural surplus, which then later on indeed led to social stratification and then to local chiefdoms, and then, let's say, gave rise to these societies to transform into something that we call the Egyptian, the pharaonic state. But in all these kind of thinking about what the Nile Valley, let's say, offered, we also learn from the ancient Egyptians themselves how much effort and work they also needed to put into making this landscape behave in the way they wanted it. Obviously, they could not control the flood of the Nile, so this was always not really controllable. But during time, they developed also all this kind of system of dams and of fields and of proper water working facilities to really make the most of the agricultural area to create all these kind of agricultural surplus, which then in the end was the backbone of pharaonic Egypt. And in this way, at least in this regard, we see lots of human interventions into, let's say, natural environments, which transform them and make them useful for the proper means of survival for the people. And also lots of effort and energy and resources and manpower needed to put into this. So when Herodotus says Egypt is the gift of the Nile, there is some truth to it, but on the other hand, there was also lots of work involved by the ancient Egyptians to really make use of what the Nile flood and all the fertile silt offered to the people and the country.
Yeah, absolutely. Like when reflecting on what you're saying with the present, because like right now we're discussing past and present, right? And going back to this project, the older members of the community have created this sense of understanding of the land, right? So it's reflecting back to how the ancient Egyptians have also understood and made use of the land somehow. So the medicinal uses of the herbs and how it helps with combating, viruses, and how now the community still uses it. For example, during COVID, because of the lack of medical services in rural areas like south of Sinai, the community went back to using plants and herbs. One of those herbs is called batharon, and it increases your immune system, like it strengthens your immune system, and they used it to combat COVID. And they have those many herbs that, helps medicinally. Like, for example, you see Musa here with a flower plant in his mouth, and this flower plant, if it's boiled and drunk, it's drunk by the Bedouin women in order to reduce period and labor pain. A lot of the women still give birth at home within the Bedouin community and within a lot of communities within Egypt, and this helps with the pain rather than modern medicine. So I'm reflecting a lot. Like even like my grandmother used to put a plant called sheikh in this mesh bag over the front entrance of her home in order to repel geckos from coming into her house. So I wonder if many of these traditions go back to the pharaonic era as well.
I was also thinking about this, and particular about the embeddedness on people in particular, let's say, if I may call them natural landscapes. I'm contradicting myself because they don't really exist. They only are there when people interact with them and conceptualize them. But I wonder, really, would you say that, let's say, Bedouin communities in these particular settings have a far more immediate and direct understanding of their surroundings, both in terms of the animal as well as the plant life? Because I'm asking myself just at the moment, would we go to a park and would we all be able to identify the individual plants and have an idea about their medical capabilities, or whether they would be venomous or not? Or if we would go to a forest to pick mushrooms, would we all be able to identify them? I'm not thinking we all have lost the connection, because I think in the modern period we are too much specialized in what we do, and living in cities offers other kind of challenges, so there is less immediate use of flora and fauna, no? But what would you say about these kind of thoughts? Particularly also thinking about the Sinai Bedouin communities and how they interact and live in these kind of settings.
Well, I feel for the Bedouin community, and that I think for the majority of indigenous communities around the world, definitely there is this sense of connectedness that many people who were sort of removed from nature because of the concrete that's creeping upon them. That's absolutely one point. But if you reflect on this connectedness and comparing it between older generations and younger generations, there is a lot of difference. Like a lot of younger generations within many indigenous communities, not just the Bedouins, many indigenous communities in Egypt and also around the world, younger generations are more interested in urban society, right? And that, I feel, the main reason of that is because of the economic pressures and climate change as well, how it's becoming harsher to live within nature and within, the raw landscape without the interference of modern technology because of climate change. And so, it's a vicious pattern. Like the actual reason of climate change is modern technology anyways, but there's definitely this, a lot of comparison between, the generations within the indigenous community, but also the communities who are within urban society, and how maybe we need to create a balance, like how we can remove the concrete as this isolator between us and nature, because I feel it changes also our sense of identity in many ways.
Yeah, but as you rightly said, this is then something that we need to do as people, as individuals, to kind of make sense and make use of also these other kind of resources. While you were talking, I was also again reflecting on ancient Egypt, because let's say, as you know, this is my specialty, and was also thinking more about what we know about the understanding of the ancient Egyptians about plant life and the animal kingdom. And we really need to know or need to understand that there was also really this very intense and deep connection. For them also the world itself was a fascinating entity to be understood. And in this way, plants were identified, or particular sycamore trees, as goddesses, or particular natural settings in the rocks were identified as sacred spaces in which divinities would live, so they would need to be cultically offered to. We know also from all the medical papyri how much, let's say, understanding and knowledge they had about the use of plants for medicinal purposes. So there was really the direct connection and use of all these resources, but obviously culturally and socially codified. So it was not, let's say, taking a plant and immediately applying it, but it was also taking a plant, transforming this plant, thinking about it, putting the use of this plant into a magical speech, into a magical context, into the performance of a ritual to heal someone, and only then these resources, these plants, these kind of things would have meaning and would be able to be powerful to do something.
Yeah, I mean, for some reason, as you're talking, I'm reflecting also on the documentation of this knowledge, how it also has changed, right? Within the Pharaonic era, it was more of they were keen on documenting, through, wall murals. Also, please correct me if
I would like to
please
continue.
But yeah, I wonder about the documentation at that time, because one of the main issues with many indigenous communities within Egypt that I've worked with is that oral history has been the only way to document this rich knowledge, and it has been lost. Like with the Nubian community, it has almost 90% lost, right? There are now a lot of initiatives by Generation Z in order to retrieve this knowledge, but trying to get it from 80 and 90-year-old generations is a bit difficult to make sure that they have retrieved their, the entire information correctly. With the Bedouin community as well, politically speaking, a lot of their archives have been removed during the occupation. So they have not been able to retrieve that and have not been able to properly document the coming history, right? And that's why they were quite keen on being part of this project. So I wonder how this documentation of rich knowledge have been moved forward, and whether within the Pharaonic era it has continued on within the current status within Egypt as well.
I strongly believe that most of the local in-depth knowledge was also transmitted orally, because let's say the most part of, let's say, the iconographic textual record that we have was penned or made for the so-called elite. So for the 5% of the state ruling, governing the country. So these were these circles in which this kind of magical / theoretical / theological knowledge was transmitted and edited and made use of. However, for these indeed peasant communities or also ancient Bedouin communities who were living in the eastern and particularly in the eastern desert, we really only have, let's say, the archaeological remains. So we have in most cases the remains of their tombs. Since they were Bedouins, they didn't really leave that many traces of any kind of settlement sites. So for the biggest part of the people living in pharaonic Egypt, we lack this information. Obviously, it might be, and I would also say there's a grain of truth in it, that in those manuals of medicine, when the use of plants and herbs is described, that they go back also to, let's say, a shared communal knowledge and understanding. However, let's say the, as I said, written, textual, and visual evidence that we have comes more from the viewpoint of the elite representing themselves and representing their power, their authority, their access to resources and manpower, and speaks thus less really about also the experience, the daily lived experience of a peasant and his family in a little village somewhere in Middle Egypt. So to learn more about these people and also Bedouin people, we really have, as archaeologists, the only possibility to look at the archaeological records. And in this case, or in most cases, we are then talking about their tombs. And we need then to study the layout, the design, and all the findings in the tombs to try to imagine these societies, these groups, their interaction, or also their territoriality, so their range or sphere of activity, and also in this way their embeddedness or attachment to the places through which they wandered or roamed or which they used. You know.
But question, like, isn't the tombs are still also like exclusive to like higher people within the societal, you know?
It depends on the, everyone in a way needs to be buried. So there is a general idea of a dead body needs to receive a safe, guarded space of depositioning, also to give the family and the heirs a place to remember. And the forms of tombs then depend on also, indeed, the social status of the person buried. If you would be a peasant, a farmer, your tomb would not be anything visible than maybe a little stone stela standing on a mound of material. And then the size, the elaboratedness of the tombs would increase until you reach those stone monuments belonging to the kings in the form of pyramids. But everything that is, let's say, monumental, made in stone, inscribed, or decorated, or indeed presents remains of texts or the so-called Egyptian visual culture, this is something that belongs to people who had the means and who had the social capital and the connections to, let's say, the higher echelons of the pharaonic state. And that's why also in many cases, we as Egyptologists, we know much more about these 5% of Egyptian civilization than we know about, indeed, all the people really producing and working every day on the fields to make the lives of those well-to-do people possible.
That's how it is always, no? But my question is, do you see some of the traces of maybe some of the traditions that you've been able to, to either learn about or discover within the contemporary society? Like, did people also put like batharon on their doorstep to repel geckos in the past?
I have seen things like that, particularly in Sudan. In Egypt, less so, But in Sudan, I've seen also the use of caught crocodiles that were put on above the gates of the houses in order to ward off any kind of evil. Also the use of particular plants and turned into color to kind of paint the skin in a particular ritual contexts. Also the fear of geckos in rooms. So to kind of try to find ways to get rid of these geckos. But my question, let's say, as the Egyptologist, or let's say in this regard more cultural anthropologist, is do we see really like a continuation of a tradition? Or do we see, let's say, the same, does it look the same, but it's motivated, culturally motivated by a different kind of context? Because let's say the thinking of pharaonic Egypt was completely different from how we these days think about us and our world. And I would say also completely different from modern Egyptians think about their world and life. But I mean, this is really the challenge to try to at least get a glimpse into the mindset of the ancient Egyptians to understand how they perceived their world. To then, on the one hand, learn that everything is so different from how we think about it today, but then on the other side, maybe also seeing connections. No?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I feel like there's always traces. Like we would discover, because we didn't learn a lot about. I mean, we've learned about like the general history of the pharaonic Egyptians, right? But you would discover like some Arabic words that, like Egyptian words that we're using, it actually goes back to the pharaonic era. Some traditions, some food, even some types of spices. So, but because of the very complex history of Egypt and the amount of colonial projects that has gone through Egypt, we have lost a lot of that. At least lost the knowledge to know what are the remaining traces in order to sort of celebrate it, I believe.
But interestingly, since these connections exist, so you mentioned these words, you mentioned some other things, like I'm thinking also of ebony, which is an Egyptian word, and also khatam for seal. So there are many words that still continue. That maybe particularly these traditions, that they remained in these local spheres, in the oral tradition, far away from all these political changes that swept over Egypt over the millennia. But I think these were indeed, tradition is really something that is lived and experienced and performed on site within these communities. And then we can really speak about these long-term survival of traditions in smaller, I don't want to say remote communities, but in villages where life is led far away from everything else that happens, let's say, in the world. And I think these are then indeed these spaces in which all these connections and traditions survived.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I mean, the rural you go, the more traditions that you see. The more traditions that you see is celebrated and really embraced by the community. As you go more urban, and as Egypt is in a new transformation of urbanization, these traditions sort of reduce because, again, going back to the metaphor of concrete separating us from nature, right? It's also separating us from our identity.
But these traditions go away, but new traditions are formed because the setting is different. Because we, as people living in these other kind of contexts, we are then creating new traditions, new ways to interact in these other spaces, which offer new challenges, but also new opportunities to create new traditions. So I think we are constantly living a life in a way informed by traditions, but these traditions are always anchored in different contexts. So
Absolutely, I agree with you. Like, if you now look at, for example, a very funny example, but if you look at the fashion like trends within Egypt right now, like it's completely inspired by ancient Egypt, and it's something that you wouldn't really see like maybe 20 years ago. 20 years ago, people were more fascinated by something that's a little bit more westernized, right? So I agree with you. I mean, traditions change, and how you connect with your identity and ancestors as well changes, and you would see a lot of the ancient Egyptian, traces being left in a modern twist, right? That maybe like our grandparents wouldn't agree on, but millennials and Gen Z do like it as well. Yeah.
Yes, and then really start a creative use of these, let's say, ancient images and ideas. And this is also, it leads us a little bit away from landscapes, but and for me, an amazingly fascinating topic, let's say the persistency about the interest of the modern world, or almost everyone, in everything ancient Egypt, and the modern use of these kind of topics and themes and images in movies, in comics, in all imaginable forms of pop culture as well, which then makes me also think ancient Egypt is very much alive, but it has also completely transformed into new spaces, into a new, it's now a new landscape in itself, the modern twist, or the modern use, modern interpretations of pharaonic Egypt, which is something that I'm also very much fascinated in. And in this way also, like, it's a tradition, almost. And I think it will remain something that will go on for the future for quite a long time.
I really hope so. As an Egyptian, I hope so.
Let's try with another title, which is Desert. What was the desert in the ancient Egypt, and what is the desert today in the modern Egypt? Is it changed or not, or is the same landscape?
Shall I start? Let's give it the historical perspective. Let's follow the timeline as good as we can. The desert in itself is a very fascinating landscape. A little, I want to say something before I go deep into, let's say, the archaeological or historical transformation of the desert. We also, when we prepared this meeting, we were talking a little bit about our own individual experiences. And I said, for me, as, let's say, a Western European coming from Germany, the desert is an even more fascinating landscape, because it's a landscape about which I have no idea. For me, it's something that is almost, it's the most exotic landscape I could imagine, because for me, I think also, how can you live in such arid environments? How is life possible? Don't you miss rain, snow, mountains, other kind of things that are then part of the individual's lived experience and knowledge of the natural surroundings? So for people who have not experienced really life in the desert, it's always it needs to remain on a theoretical level, what the desert is, how it feels. Because for us, it's something super exotic and fascinating. But for people living there, we live in Turin, so we are used to the city. But a person from a desert, if you put him into Turin, he would also feel something very exotic and new and transforming. No? Anyway, coming back to more the history of the desert. This is also, thanks to studies that have been undertaken in the last decades, we now know much more about the deserts, both on the west and east of the Nile. We have learned that particularly after the so-called Holocene Green Sahara, so about 10,000 BC, before all the Sahara and the Western Desert was a savanna-like environment, also with lakes and far more wildlife and plant life. But then at the end of this Holocene period, there was a climate shift because the monsoonal rains over Ethiopia receded, and less precipitation went down over the northern part of the Sahara, which then led to a continuing slow desertification or aridification, which in the end we see nowadays. So we are now at, let's say, the current end of this whole process. And so, and thinking or knowing this, the archaeologist who is informed about all these transformations also looks at the desert with different eyes. Maybe the archaeologist even less than the geologist, who have an even deeper insight into far wider reaching time periods. However, also we as archaeologists, when we look at the desert, we think about the change of these spaces over time. When we study particular archaeological remains, we are now always trying to understand in which kind of natural setting these archaeological remains were created. So in which natural environment did those people create this settlement or set up this necropolis? And in this way, far away from thinking about this vast, barren, endless, stony, rocky, sandy nothingness, there was and is so much of archaeology and traces and human activities that have materialized in so many different ways, so that for us as archaeologists, to sum up, the desert is not this empty space of zero-ness, but particularly speaking about the eastern and western desert of Egypt, or also continuing south to the Sudan, it was a lived space. There were always people living, passing by, interacting, making use of, again, what the desert offered and trying to find ways to move or get along in these also changing situations.
Yeah, I just want to say the desert is still with life. And I mean, speaking about the desert specifically in Sinai, it's I mean, it's full of a lot. I mean, the community called them gardens, right? A lot of gardens, and it snows in the winter. By the way, we have snow in Egypt, guys, in St. Catherine's, and yeah, absolutely. I mean. The desert is, of course, a lot less intimidating to Egyptians, but it's still, for those who have been brought up within the urban society, it's, of course, quite difficult to be integrated within the desert. But once you go in and understand the traditions and how to navigate and how to coexist with the desert and with nature in general, you become very adaptive, right? And I just want to say a very quick story, actually, about the desert. During COVID, like the start of COVID, we've had almost a 10-year drought in St. Catherine's. There were no rainwater coming in, so a lot of the gardens that the community kept dried up. And a week after lockdown, a major flood occurred, and it completely transformed the desert. So a lot of the barren gardens that dried out because of the drought, it blossomed back, and a lot of the herbs that disappeared or have become scarce, it became quite abundant, including the batharon plant that the community started to use to combat COVID. So for them, it was not just a miracle, but for them, it was a proof of how if you respect the land, if you keep the land and maintain it, the land will, give back and also, help you survive, right? So it's yeah, I mean, the desert, I mean, with all of the transformations that Johannes has mentioned, talking about the current state of the desert, environmentally speaking, there have been, yes, a lot of droughts and a lot of changes. This year we've had a lot of rain, which is great. for urban people, maybe they would say, no rain, we don't want any rain. But for the desert people, we would say yes to rain because we call it the blessings from Allah because, you know, it brings a lot of life into the desert and a lot of plants come up and a lot of produce, right? And but there is this one element that's creeping back into the desert or creeping from the urban society into the remaining natural landscapes within Egypt, and that's concrete. And that's also something that we wanted to speak about.
Yeah, when we prepared, we also spoke about, indeed, the urbanization of desert landscapes that is currently ongoing also in Egypt with all these new residential complexes, the new capital city, and also other projects like the Wadi al-Jadida project to find ways to create new agricultural lands to support the also ever-growing population of Egypt. And the interesting thing that we saw in these, let's say, modern encroachments into these potentially pristine landscapes, which we as archaeologists know that they were not pristine, there was always human presence that materialized in different ways and forms, that these landscapes indeed are transformed into something which only humans can do with so much money and concrete and energy, transforming let's say currently based on the climatic conditions, indeed hyper-arid zones into residential complexes with villas, with pools and palm gardens and everything. So lots of irrigation and power needs to be put in, and everything in a way then materializes thanks to this artificial material, concrete, or it concretizes. So this human approach or encroachment into the desert in, let's say, finding ways outside of the rather strict and narrow Nile Valley and the Delta, which is really under settlement and development pressure. So that's why also in Egypt there is this, they seek for other zones to find space and new landscapes for their people. And so in this way then really modernity, or this idea of how to create new urban spaces, but for me they're also not really urban because there are these American model of suburbia, so one house next to the other, so not really creating so much community spaces. So maybe the only community space is the biggest supermarket around the corner, but not really places to meet and to exchange. So in this way then concrete, adds a layer over the desert, which then makes the desert as it was completely invisible and changes and turns it into modern, developed residential zones.
Yeah, you're raising actually right now two questions that we need to discuss, and one is like, what is modernity? Because a lot of people confuse modernity with westernization, right? We can remain modern, but with embracing our own traditions, or we can blindly follow Western styles and Western lifestyle and call ourselves modern, but we're not really modern because we're letting go of our traditions. So that's not actually, very very modern. Right, and
very difficult.
It's very difficult, yeah. Especially honestly with communities that have been colonialized before, because there have been a lot of struggles, internal struggles of actually embracing your identity, because for so long you've been taught that you're less because of this, this colonial state coming in and showing its power and showing its hierarchy. So I think it's a very complex issue that a lot of countries are going through, and a lot of countries are trying to break through as well, embracing our identity away from the colonialization of it for so many years. So that's one. So I feel that this definitely goes with the idea of being disconnected from the land, hence your identity. And that also raises the question of when is urbanization a positive transformation and when is it negative? And like from my experience as a photographer and also as an Egyptian living right now in this modern transformation of the landscape, I feel like whenever the concrete is being used to isolate us from the landscape, this is when it's a negative transformation, rather than coexisting with the landscape, right? And understanding how we can use concrete or any other modern technologies in order to elevate our lives within the same landscape. Right? And I also would love to hear your thoughts about that. Also, reflecting upon also how ancient Egyptians have adapted with the transformation of the environment during their time as well.
Let me think what I want to say. I mean, what we know and what we learn from pharaonic Egypt is indeed they really became experts in making use of, let's say, all the natural resources. And I mean, the most numerous building material was the mud brick, and even the unfired mud brick, so the sun-dried mud brick. So most of buildings in pharaonic Egypt, so all the villages and settlements and everything that is more domestic than formal, was built in mud brick, and which is then a very specific use of the Nile silt. You take this and you temper it with some straw and some other organic material to kind of add this strength and stability. And this is the material. And interestingly, also this material has then wonderful climatic capabilities in those rooms that are built of mud brick. So they tend to be cooler in the summer and keep the warmth in the winter. So there is a nice after effect, let's say, of the use of these natural materials. And when it then comes to formal architecture, then the Egyptians were experts also in excavating stones of all different kind of types and hardnesses for creating all these temples. And in this way, they use these natural resources or materials, but they also cut all these rocks into rectangular pieces. So they socialized this stone and turned this stone into something useful for people to create these buildings. And the same, indeed, I might come back to the mud brick. Also, this is, let's say, a rectangular element. So also in this way, let's say, nature is controlled. So what nature offers is put into form, and this form is then multiplied and is then used for creating all these housing structures. However, this was not really an answer to your question, I am afraid.
But I actually want to say, but I just wanted to comment that both building methods are also ancient within the Bedouin community as well, using the rocks within the environment, but also mud bricks. Like my community clinic was built with the mud bricks.
Yeah. No, in this case, you really referred back to, indeed, again, traditional building methods and materials. But maybe for us, modernity always in tra virgolette, concrete it's such an artificial material, and maybe speaks also about, I don't want to say the artificiality of the built environment which we create around us, but it might add to this particular sensation of maybe a bit of a disconnection between landscape and nature. But this is something that also, looking back into history, let's say, I would say started with the so-called Neolithic revolution, when people started to be sedentary, when they started animal husbandry, when they started to do agriculture, when they really started to transform their environment and, as I said, made use of it. And this is, I think, something that continues until today.
This can be the modernity.
That this is, let's say, the human use of all the resources available that are, let's say, in one moment of time, then also by the Romans with the concrete and opus cementitium, is there are, let's say, artificial building materials made, and this is a continuing way of how modern people now make use of these resources or transform them into something artificial.
This is an answer to your question. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. The last title is a civilization. The impact of the transformation of a civilization in these landscapes, in your opinion?
Again, we do the timeline. I mean, I think in a way, some of the things that I mentioned in my earlier answers also go back to this. Obviously, the Nile Valley, the Nile and the fertile zones offer these potential, let's say this natural environmental potential for the civilization of Pharaonic Egypt to create. There is also this theory by anthropologists, Canero, for instance, of these river-based civilizations. So we have the Indus civilization, and there's Mesopotamia, and there's Egypt, so that there is a certain predisposition. So once the landscape offers opportunities to those people living there, there's, according to these anthropologists, let's say, almost inevitable transformation into social differentiation and the growth of something that we are used to call civilization. On the other hand, there might be some truth to it, no? That landscapes and these resources offer these possibilities, but as I already said, it's really the people who make use of it and who transform it and who again, use these resources based on their understanding how to. So I think on the one hand, Pharaonic Egypt grew in this spaces of opportunity. On the other hand, Pharaonic Egypt also made intensely use of these resources and even scaled all these kind of things up to create this state, to create all these surplus.
It was modern.
In a way.
Well, I can't help but I actually need to do that to reflect on what you're saying, but also like the current state and the present status within Egypt as well, and what I see from what you're saying is that how the community, like the entire community, the entire societal hierarchy of ancient Egypt were all within the same direction of understanding nature and making use of it in order to adapt and to thrive, right? And you would really see that within the indigenous communities. We have, by the way, 20 plus different indigenous communities within Egypt. So we have Bedouin communities, we have Amazigh, we have Nubians, so many different types of or cultures of native people within Egypt, and the commonality of between them and also between the indigenous communities at large is that how modern they are and how they adapt within nature, right? How they understand nature and how they coexist with it and in order to thrive, and how they understand how to build their own buildings. For example, I'll give you a very quick example of how the Bedouin community know where the path of floods are, and from there they avoid building their houses or schools or whatever. But the change here is the separation between this knowledge of the people who are living in the land and the government, which is the people who are actually doing something, right? They have this authority to build whatever and do whatever. And an example of that is when the government decided to build these series of medical units within Sinai, finally there's going to be medical services, right? Not because they didn't listen to the Bedouin people, so they built almost all of them at the path of the flood. So when the flood came, all of these hospitals or units were completely destroyed. And even before the flood come, for the people, they lost this sense of trust, right? Because like you should listen to us, right? We are the people who are living within this land. And so when they find that there isn't any acceptance of their rich knowledge, they would lose this trust. So they didn't even like go into these medical units, even though they really need it. But they have lost this. If you can't trust us, we're not going to be able to trust you with our life, right?
So who is more modern, authority or?
Exactly, who's more modern? The indigenous people. We need to learn more from them.
But you're making a very interesting point. Is really the local embeddedness of knowledge, and how space and knowledge are interconnected, and how people who have experienced particular spaces over a long time and who have traditionally passed on this knowledge to generations have this kind of on-field, on-site local understanding of all the opportunities, but also all the challenges and dangers of what these spaces offer. And indeed, authorities, let's say, the state is not really that much listening to local knowledge. And so this is a perfect example of how then an overarching organizational institution imposes something disregarding these local knowledge about space. And I think, yeah.
It's a popular pattern now, how there's this separation between the local people and, you know, the authorities. So, yeah, absolutely.
And this local knowledge, we could also then think about a different kind of terminology, is then indeed what we already use, let's say the attachment or the embeddedness of those people at these spaces or in these settings. And let's say the state as such oversees vast territories and thus cannot have this detailed on the ground level understanding. And so, yeah, and in this way then these identities of people in their landscapes are forged, are created, and in this way it is a fascinating thing for you as a photographer to, let's say, listen to them and also document in a way their lifestyle, because what you can do is something like participatory observation in a way, like the method of cultural anthropology, which I think every Egyptologist would love to do, to go back at least one day into ancient Egypt and just be there and see and feel and smell and you know, get a sense of how this felt, being aware obviously that the Egyptologist would come from far away and his mindset would completely be different, and he or she would also have issues in really understanding what they would see. But with your work also, working in direct contact and communication with these local communities, you have the possibility and the direct possibility to communicate and to observe and to interact and to ask and to learn about them, which I envy you for. So.
Well, that's what I love about storytelling, and in my practice, I prefer to collaborate as well. You would hear a lot within the photographic, language. You would hear a lot the word subject. You would see a subject, and you would take photographs of that subject. And for me, that is not a proper representation of the people that you need to connect with and the landscape that you need to understand in order to tell a story. You need to collaborate with the community. You need to collaborate with the protagonists of your story. They're not just mere subjects. They are protagonists. And I think this is something that we also have in common, right? And within my practice, it's not just like a photographic reportage. It also includes a lot of mediums. You mentioned like how you want to go back and smell and taste and and understand how we human beings connect to stories and connect to other human beings is through this multi-sensory manner, right? And as a visual storyteller, it's also something that I really wanted to do. Because photography, it creates a lot of limits. Like it, of course, creates a lot of bridges and a lot of ways to connect, but also a lot of, limits that you would realize. And within this project, I wanted to include the voices of the community visually within the project. And so they started to add their own interventions into the work, adding embroidery. The women added embroidery onto their own photographs. And the older members, they forged plants and wrote down with their own handwriting, you would see it here, wrote down with their own handwriting the medicinal uses of these plants. And I feel like in that way, it became this alternative archive for them. It's something that we don't have for the ancient Egyptians, but it's something that we try to do now because this is the future history, right? And for the community, this has become their own archive, their own way to document who they are in this multidisciplinary format.
I think that Johannes wants to come back soon in Egypt, yeah?
Yes, please.
He wants. Okay.
I'll be waiting.
Ok, it's clear. Grazie, volevo davvero ringraziarvi per queste bellissime parole, per la vostra narrazione. Siamo riusciti a definire un concetto comune di modernità in un'ora e un quarto di discussione, non è semplice. E poi soprattutto siamo riusciti a parlare di luoghi in un'epoca in cui la politica, la geopolitica ci divide sui luoghi. Noi grazie all'arte e allo studio siamo riusciti a rimanere uniti, quindi davvero grazie per il vostro lavoro, grazie per le vostre suggestioni e teniamoci in contatto. Grazie davvero.
Grazie.